Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the third installment of our critical reasoning series. I am Ryan Starr. I'm a Manhattan Prep instructor. You can see my email address on the screen there. Take it down. Tell your friends to send me emails and see what happens. Guys, participate as much as you'd like in the chat window. Ask questions, answer questions. It makes things way more fun. And then all the people who watch this on YouTube later will be jealous. So win-win as far as I'm concerned. You can indeed get the link to the previous two sessions in the description of the video. And there will be a fourth session in which this is all tied to the data insights section. All right, so this time we are focusing on boldface questions and inference questions. We, in the previous ones, saw assumption, strengthen, and weaken, and evaluate discrepancy and fill in the blank. So if you're looking at those other two links, these first two things are the things you are going to see in those links. Today, argument structure, aka boldface questions, and inference or draw conclusion questions. These two just happen to have different names for the same thing. And one thing to make really, really clear, whether you see a question asking you what can be inferred from the statements or what's best supported by the statements above, or what conclusion can be most properly drawn from the statements above, it's the same question type. They're asking for the same thing. I'm good, everyone. How are you? So nice to see ya. All right. Here we go. So, some ground rules just in case you're totally new to critical reasoning. All right, totally fine. You've got a place here. So, the parts of a critical reasoning argument, the parts that absolutely must appear in all critical reasoning arguments except inference questions, so these are going to be an exception, would be the conclusion, main claim of the argument, the thing that the argument is centered around, the whole reason the argument exists. It's the author's position or belief or plan or proposal, prediction, that sort of thing. And it's always an opinion. It's never going to be a fact. If it were a fact, this wouldn't be an argument. It would just be an informative passage, right? So the conclusion always has to be an opinion. And when we talk about the conclusion, especially the main conclusion of an argument, we're talking about the author's opinion, the opinion of the author of the argument. Okay. However, a conclusion alone does not an argument make. You've also got to have at least one premise supporting that conclusion, right? You go to somebody and just tell them your opinion on something. You haven't made an argument. You've just made a statement at that point, right? But if you back up that opinion with some reasons or some evidence, now you've made an argument. And that is how basically all of these arguments are going to go, again, with the exception of inference questions, which we are going to see in just a little bit. For boldface questions, you're definitely going to need to know these parts of an argument. Now, those two parts, I should say, before I go on to counterpoint, those two parts, conclusion and premise, those are the parts that will be in all assumption-based questions, evaluate the argument, assumption, strengthen, weaken, and to some degree even explain a discrepancy and fill in the blank questions. These are necessary for an argument. However, there are other things that can show up in an argument, and this is especially true in the boldface questions that we're going to look at. One such thing is counterpoint, and I'd even break counterpoint down into two separate things. There will often be a claim that goes against the author's main conclusion in a boldface question, and there will often be a premise supporting that opposing claim. So counterpoint can really be a whole counter argument, a counter conclusion, and a counter premise. And then there is sometimes background information, or I'd call it neutral information. Sometimes it is truly just background, just kind of setting the stage for something. But other times there's neutral information that gets used to bolster one claim, but then gets turned around by the author to bolster the author's claim or something like that. So there are like disputed findings, or there's a finding whose consequences are at issue in the argument, or things like that. So background and other kind of neutral stuff will be either not relevant to any of the conclusions or claims, that would be background, or used by both the main conclusion and any counter conclusion that's in the argument. All right, you can have lots of kind of neutral or disputed information in an argument too, especially again in boldface questions. For most arguments, you don't have to worry about these last two. They are thrown into boldface questions because the whole point of boldface questions is to confuse you about who's saying what, whose position is what, and stuff like that. And so the more they can put into those questions, the more kind of changes in direction and stuff like that, the harder those questions get, as we will soon see. There are other parts of an argument that can come up. For instance, in fact, let's look at a slightly more complex argument with a different part in it. So, this argument, for instance, we've got a plan here, right? A provincial government plans to raise the gasoline tax to give people an incentive to drive less, reducing traffic congestion in the long term. However, skeptics point out that most people in the province live in areas where cars are the only viable transportation to jobs and stores and therefore cannot greatly change their driving habits in response to higher gasoline prices. Ignoring the question here, notice that this argument has a provincial government offering a plan, right? Raise the gasoline tax, and a consequence for that plan, reducing traffic congestion in the long term. Now, it's not totally fair to call raising the gasoline tax a premise, though it is a bit of a background and it does kind of lead to this thing here. And so it is kind of acting as a premise, but it's also the government's plan. And if you were trying to weaken this argument, you'd have to get some information down from the prompt about which thing to treat as the conclusion. Are we trying to go against the plan, or are we trying to go against the idea that the plan will have this proposed consequence? Basically, there are sometimes a couple of things that could act as the conclusion. And in those cases, you want to see which of those conclusions is supporting which. Essentially, there are going to be some what are called intermediate conclusions that, are themselves opinions or positions or claims or things like that, often based on premises of their own, but that go on to support further conclusions. All right? And the argument, the answer choices could trade on any of those things. So there is more complexity than just those 4 parts shown on the previous slide, but very, very basically, as you go into boldface questions, conclusions, premises, counter conclusions, counter premises, and neutral information will be there. There can be some more exciting stuff. And the harder the questions get, the more specific the descriptions of the parts of the answer will become. All right. Now, when you're doing boldface questions, probably the most important thing to pay attention for is transition words, keywords. However's, therefores, consequently, in this ways, this can be seen from, things like that. And it should be noted that these questions are basically identical in the skills they test and the kind of the research they require from you to specific purpose questions in reading comprehension. Those questions that ask the author mentions blank in order to. Same skill set, same question type. Basically, boldface questions in critical reasoning are asking for the purpose of the boldface portions. All right, so if you are good at reading comprehension specific purpose questions, you can transfer those skills over here. If you are good at these particular questions, the boldface ones, you can transfer these skills over to reading comprehension specific purpose questions. And the same is going to be true of inference questions here. So these are the 2 types of critical reasoning questions that actually have the most overlap with reading comprehension. Everything else, everything in the assumption family is fundamentally different from reading comprehension, because in the assumption family, your right answer is going to contain new information, whereas in reading comprehension, the right answer should basically never contain new information. These 2 question types we're going to be looking at, describe the role or boldface, and inference or draw a conclusion. The right answer shouldn't really contain new information. In boldface questions, the right answer should just be describing what you see in the boldface portions doing. And in inference questions, the right answer should just be more or less restating what's already there, but usually with a reformulation. More on that in a bit. Right? Because we're going to start with some boldface questions first, and then we'll get to some inference questions. All right, separate it out that way. Typically, a simple boldface question might have one boldface portion, but the typical thing is for boldface questions to have two boldface portions, such as this one. And what's going to happen in the answer choices is when you have two boldface portions, the answer choices will always break down into two pieces. One piece describing the first of the boldface portions, one piece describing the second of the boldface portions. You can start with either piece of the answer choices that you want, meaning if you find it easier to judge the second boldface portion, go for it. Judge the second boldface portion, get a short list of answers from that. And you can then use whatever's left over in the answer choices to help you figure out the first boldface portion. It may be that once you've eliminated some answers based on the easier of the boldface portions, the harder of the boldface portions for you will come into more focus because maybe the remaining answer choices only leave one viable candidate for that, right? So don't feel like you have to go in order of the way the boldface portions appear. That's thing number one. Now, thing number two, the actual analysis. There are a few ways you can pull this off. One is keywords around the boldface portions. So for instance, this first boldface portion comes, whoops, forgive me on that. Still going to happen. This first boldface portion comes after these executives claim that, which is, kind of a signal as to what that boldface portion is doing, right? It tells you this boldface portion is undeniably a claim of some kind. And even though this argument, as you can see up top, is attributed to media critic, this particular claim is attributed to these executives. And as everybody knows, executives can't be trusted, right? This is almost definitely bad news. Either way, one thing you know from that is it's a claim. Now, this leads to the other way of analyzing these boldface portions. So keywords, surrounding words are going to be hugely important. Surrounding sentences are going to be hugely important because, of course, all these arguments have sentences that kind of dovetail one into the next, right? A lot of sentences get their purpose from the sentences before them and stuff like that, just like in reading comprehension. The other way to analyze these boldface portions is to look at them themselves and decide basically two things about them. One, are they facts or opinions? All right. If it's a fact, it might show up in the answers as, say, evidence or a premise or something like that, right? If it's opinion, it'll often show up in the answers as a claim, a position, a belief, or something along those lines. Now, that's definitely more true in the easier boldface questions, but as it happens, I chose some pretty hard boldface questions mostly for today. So, as I mentioned before, the harder boldface questions will be a little bit more nuanced in their answer choices. They'll be a little bit more specific. So notice, like, even though we know the first is a claim of some kind, none of these answers really says the first is a claim. He gives us the first acknowledges a position, and position is more or less equivalent to claim, but none of them flat out says the first is a claim, because they want to make this a little bit harder on us. Still, the first one is absolutely an opinion. It's on the claimy side, and so any answer that makes the first seem as though it is a straight fact is going to be wrong. That's one way to analyze these boldface portions. The other lens to analyze them through, if you're going straight for the boldface portions, is, are they on the author's side, which in this case would be media critic's side, against the author, or neutral? Neutral or disputed, right? Like DMZ territory. if you can decide these two things about both boldface portions, you're in pretty good shape. And you will often have to use the keywords in the surrounding sentences to decide it. That is what a lot of the answers are going to be getting at. Notice that, like A, for instance, says the first is an inevitable trend that weighs against the critic's claim. The critic's claim, of course, is going to be the main claim of the argument because this argument is attributed to media critic, right? So whatever the critic's claim is, that is the conclusion. That's the author's conclusion here. And A is kind of saying that this first boldface portion in some way goes against that author's position. All right, so it would be an against answer. And there's a really good chance that that's correct because, again, this first claim is attributed to these executives. And usually, if a person's making an argument of their own and they cite somebody else's claim, they're just going to go against that claim at some point, right? They're going to talk about how wrong that claim is. Not always, but often. All right. Now, to really pull this off, especially the is this thing on the author's side or against the author or neutral part of the analysis, you do indeed need to know the author's main conclusion. Basically, to do a boldface question well, you always have to start by identifying the author's main conclusion. Not necessary to do that to know whether a boldface portion is fact or opinion, but it is necessary to do that to know whether a boldface portion goes against the author's conclusion or is on the side of the author's conclusion or doesn't really touch the author's conclusion. So this purple analysis, you need to know the author's conclusion for. Where is the author's conclusion here? Which sentence is the author's conclusion? Can you pick it out? Tell me in the chat window if you can spot it. The media critic's conclusion. Bhavana says the last line. And yeah, can't argue with that. It's absolutely the last line. The previous sentence starts with a however, so it's marking a change in direction, but then it also goes on to say research shows that, which means that previous sentence cannot be a conclusion. Conclusions aren't going to be prefaced with things that make them seem like facts, like research shows that, right? And so this last sentence basically has to be the author's conclusion because it's only from the however onwards that we're getting media critics' whole argument, right? Everything else before that is about what network executives believe, but these last two sentences aren't attributed to network executives or anything like that. There's a however, then research shows, then this demonstrates that, right? This is in the author's own voice. And the last sentence is the conclusion. That in turn helps you to judge the second boldface portion because it's coming right before the author's conclusion. And of course helps you judge the first boldface portion as well, because looking at the author's conclusion, alternative platforms will not prevent networks from increasing advertising revenue. And comparing it to that first boldface portion, declining viewership will cause advertising revenue to fall, and networks will thus be unable to spend the large sums necessary to produce high-quality programming. You can see that the author's position, the critic's position, is very much against that first boldface portion, that first claim. All right. That is the kind of analysis you want to know. All right. First one's a claim. The author is against it. It's attributed to the network executives. You know the author's against it because the author's own position basically says the opposite thing. You kind of know it from the however, and from the fact, again, that this is attributed to somebody else. The second boldface portion, it's a little bit trickier, but it's still in a sentence that starts with research shows that, and it's still leading into the conclusion. So we know it's on the author's side. And it's cited as a fact. Fact on the author's side is basically a premise supporting the conclusion. Now, we need to find answers that more or less map to this, or an answer that more or less maps to both of these things. but we're going to have to use process of elimination as well. So, which answers can we confidently eliminate? Toss some out there that we can get rid of for sure, for sure. Which answers are violation? Or let's make a call on answer by answer. A. First is an inevitable trend that weighs against the critic's claim. Fair? Fair to call it that? Or look at the second. The second is the claim, meaning, of course, the critic's claim. Any part of A disagree with y'all? What do you guys think? All right, all right. Andy, I'm assuming Inance, you're saying A and E just will not work. Bhavana disagrees with A. Arun seems to like A maybe, but Deepak likes B. Fair. Disagreeing with A is the right call. So, okay, a couple of things about it. One, they call the first an inevitable trend, which is already pretty bad because, you know, the critic doesn't think this trend is inevitable, right? The critic thinks this trend is actually not even going to be a thing and it'll go the other way. All right. In fact, the critic cites like evidence research that says that it's going the other way. So that part of A is already bad, but it may be easier to just look at the second part and say, absolutely not. Remember, a claim is an opinion, a conclusion, that sort of thing, right? The critic's claim is, as we discussed, in the very last sentence, right? Which means the second boldface portion is not that claim, right? If anything, it's supporting that claim, but it's not fair to call it the claim itself. That would be the last sentence. And so A gets eliminated for a couple of reasons. But notice, you don't have to spot both of them. Any one thing that's wrong with an answer ruins the answer. Yep. All right. So we seem to have some agreement about A and E. A lot of agreement about A and E. Nice. And some agreement about D as well. Some disagreement about B and C. So let's look at E next. The first opposes the critic's claim through an analogy is probably already bad. I think this is a good call because what analogy? Second outlines a scenario in which that claim will not hold. That claim, of course, refers to the critic's claim, and so the second part makes it seem like the second boldface portion goes against that critic's claim, and that is absolutely not the case. Good elimination. D, first acknowledges a position that the technology executives accept as true. Hard to argue with that. This is the network executives' claim, though these are network executives and not technology executives. That might be a thing that we worry about. You're on the bubble, technology executives. The second, however, is a consequence of that position. No. The second is absolutely not a consequence of that position because of the however. The second is something that fundamentally goes against that position. And so now we're down to B and C, which both seem to have takers, but B seems a bit more popular. First is a prediction that is challenged by the argument. Okay, so is the first a prediction at all? Prediction is in line with claim and stuff like that. Like a lot of claims are themselves predictions. And if we look at it, declining viewership will cause advertising revenue to fall and networks will thus be unable to spend, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's definitely a prediction, right? It's in the future tense. That's all it takes for something to be a prediction. The second is a finding. All right, finding's pretty good for a fact-based thing. Like finding is one of the ways they'll refer to facts, just as evidence is. A finding upon which the argument depends. Now, the argument is a bit cryptic here. When they say the argument in these questions, what they really mean is the author's conclusion. The argument, the author, and the author's conclusion are all basically one and the same. So when you see something referring to the argument here, it's specifically referring to that last line, the crux of the media critic's argument, that conclusion there. And the second is then a finding, right? It's something shown by research. It is a finding. And it is a finding upon which the argument depends because it is leading into that conclusion. And you know that, if from nothing else, from the keywords, this demonstrates that, boom, conclusion, right? That this refers to what the author just said. And the author is making it explicit that what the author just said demonstrates the author's conclusion, right? So B is looking pretty good. In which case, what specifically is wrong with C? I'm going to toss this to y'all. What specific part of C is not the greatest? It's not the thing. Yes, by the way, Bhavna, the argument in an option is always the same as the main conclusion. Always. It's just one of the ways they reference the main conclusion without saying main conclusion. And like I say, it's kind of a sneaky thing that they do. So yeah, exactly that. Yeah, clarifies the reasoning behind the critic's claim is basically the inappropriate part about C. The first boldface portion is the is the executive's claim, nothing to do with the critic's claim, right? And certainly doesn't clarify any reasoning behind the critic's claim. It's on the opposite side. Good. And so B, it absolutely is. A, C, D, and E all have something wrong with them. Notice that's kind of subtle. The first clarifies the reasoning behind the critic's claim. Like you could easily just ignore the critic's part there and think, yeah, executive's claim. Like it's really, really easy to accidentally do that. So watch the wording, right? It's like part of the advantage they get from having both points of view here, the executive's point of view and the critic's point of view, is that they get to try to mix them around in the answer choices to, you know, confuse everybody. That's their game. All right. Sabitas, questions on this one? Things that got you, qualms you have with it? Yeah, and the second is actually supporting that claim, the critic's claim. So flawed is also totally off. If you read critics as executives, C starts becoming a very tempting answer. But, of course, that's not what it says, and that's a huge part of the reason it's wrong. Well done. Well done. Good analysis on C, y'all. When you're studying verbal, it is really, really important, especially when you review the questions, to put into your own words exactly why the wrong answers are wrong. That is always the skill you're trying to build when you practice verbal, because you get to the test, and I'm sure you guys have been there. If you've taken practice tests or done practice questions, you often get it down to two answers, right? And to choose right between those two answers, you have to have some experience talking yourself out of wrong answers for reasons and talking yourself into right answers for reasons. So make sure you do this analysis on all the questions when you practice them in verbal before you go to explanations or anything like that. It's important that this analysis come from you first, and then you can verify it with explanations. Oh, yeah, great question. Basically never. The inference questions basically never have conclusions. You want to take them usually as just a series of facts. I don't want to say never, never. Like I say basically never to qualify it slightly, because I'm sure there are like one or two out there that have conclusions, but even then you're not really treating them as conclusions, right? Like the whole thing with conclusions in these questions is everything centers around the conclusion. You interpret everything through the lens of the author's conclusion. And the whole thing with conclusions in all the other question types, the assumption family and explain the discrepancy, is those conclusions are reached in kind of an irresponsible fashion. The argument's missing something that would have better explained or supported that conclusion. Even if then an inference question has a conclusion, it's not going to be like important that you figure out what's wrong with that conclusion. So functionally, it wouldn't really matter if an inference question had a conclusion, but usually they tell you to treat all the passage in an inference question as true, and then they just ask you which of the following must be true. We're going to see them in a minute. I want to give you guys at least one more boldface question to work on. Yeah, inference questions often are from combinations of premises, just like a series of facts, and then you're drawing a conclusion from those premises, but it shouldn't feel like the GMAT's own conclusions, which again are never fully supported. You've got to basically derive something equally factual from that series of premises. All right, more on that later. We got to do at least one more boldface question, if not two. This time though, I'm going to let you guys take the lead on this one. I'm going to hang back for a minute as you read it. And if you like an answer, kick it out into the chat window. All right, anybody feeling good about an answer here? Pop it in to the chat window. Don't worry if you're wrong. It's only going on YouTube for all of time. Just kidding. I've totally been wrong on YouTube before. You guys can see it. It's embarrassing. Sweet. One person going on record in favor of B. C's got some love as well. Some more B's though coming in. Ooh, strong support for B, it looks like. All right. Cool. Let's discuss B versus C, because those are our two chosen answers. B says the first is a fact. Let's just look at that. First and foremost, though all previous studies on the relationship between fatty fish and the prevalence of kidney cancer have been inconclusive. It's absolutely a fact, right? They're citing previous studies and just saying what the results of those studies were. Anything cited as like the result of research or the result of studies or things like that, absolutely to be taken as a fact. So that part of B checks out. First is a fact. Does it go against the argument that is being presented? Well, of course, as we said last time, the argument that is being presented means the author's conclusion, which I guess in this case would be the conclusion of the team of Swedish scientists, right? The Swedish scientists basically reached the conclusion that the lower rate of kidney cancer is due to the increased intake of omega-3 fatty acids. But this particular boldface portion, the first one, says all previous studies on the relationship between fatty fish and the prevalence of kidney cancer have been inconclusive. So the Swedish scientists have reached a conclusion about a connection between kidney cancer and the consumption of fatty fish. That's also clear from the previous statement there, right? The fact that all previous studies have been inconclusive definitely makes this study look like an exception, and in a certain way, like, casts some doubt on this study, right? Like, all previous studies on the relationship between fatty fish and the prevalence of kidney cancers have been inconclusive, but the Swedish study somehow is not. Now, does that mean that this fact goes against the argument that's being presented? If you're not sure, remember, keywords, transition words, still do you a huge favor. Last time we saw the importance of however for signaling the shift from the other people's argument to the media critics' argument, right? Though is also a contrast word. And given that this though is before the very fact, or at the beginning of the very fact that we are discussing now, the other part of this sentence is about how the Swedish scientists did reach this conclusion that no other study could reach. It's fair to say that this is a fact that goes against the argument that's being presented. It's pretty darn fair. Now, the second is one element of a logical argument in support of the scientist's claim. So, is it now? Second says lean fish is rarely rich in omega-3s. And then it goes on with, and those in the study who ate lean fish, so still trading on this lean fish thing, had the same risk for developing renal cell carcinoma as those who ate no fish at all. Renal cell carcinoma is, of course, a type of kidney cancer that has been brought up earlier in the argument. So this lean fish is rarely rich in omega-3s is connected not only to the omega-3s claim in the previous sentence, but to the following part in this sentence that says lean fish had no effect on reducing kidney cancer. So why bring up that lean fish is rarely rich in omega-3s before going on to say that lean fish did not save anybody from kidney cancer? It is in support of the scientist's claim. Like, the scientist's claim is you got to eat that fatty fish to get the omega-3s, and it's the omega-3s from the fatty fish that help with the kidney cancer. And don't believe us? Look what happens when people ate fish that wasn't fatty. No protection from kidney cancer, right? So this last sentence is kind of showing what happened with, the control group, essentially, right? The group who was on the other side of the fatty fish thing. And if those people saw no relief from kidney cancer, but the people who ate the fatty fish definitely did, then yeah, that bolsters the conclusion that the fatty fish is having some sort of effect. All right. Calling it one element of a logical argument, that's totally fair because it is. The second part of this sentence after the and is the other part of this logical argument. And B is therefore looking pretty good. We'll examine C real quick. The first presents the quandary the scientists are attempting to solve. And the second is the result of that quandary. Basically, so quandary is like a problem, a conundrum, right? Something, a puzzle that they're trying to figure out. For C to be right, the scientists would be trying to solve why all those other studies are inconclusive, right? If the first is the quandary the scientists are trying to solve, they're not trying to solve then whether, kidney cancer can be prevented by eating more fatty fish. They'd have to be trying to solve what's up with all these inconclusive studies. Why are they so inconclusive? And so that's basically a problem, right? This is not what they're attempting to solve. It's just an inconvenient truth that casts some doubt on their results. Also, not totally fair to say the second is the result of that quandary because that supposed quandary is about relationship between fatty fish and kidney cancer, and the second boldface portion is about lean fish. So the second boldface portion can't possibly be the result of that quandary. And I'm not sure what the result of a quandary even looks like, honestly. B is absolutely the one. And I think the real takeaway here is that in boldface questions, B is literally always the answer. Right? Good. Responsible takeaway. Take that to the bank. Don't do that. That's bad takeaway. Questions on this one? All right. Notice that these answers were a bit less nuanced than the last set of answers, right? A lot of these have more generic language, a claim in support of the argument, a piece of evidence against the argument. This is the kind of language you expect to see in mid-level questions of the boldface type and easier questions of the boldface type. The hardest questions of the boldface type have answers more like what we saw in the last case, in which the answers are more specifically descriptive of what the boldface portions are doing rather than, as in this case, generically descriptive of what the boldface portions are doing. Yeah, and it is easy to get this from process elimination. Like in a lot of ways, this is an easier question than the last one. It just occurred to me, I shouldn't just show you the hardest ones. You should see what the typical ones look like too. Yeah, process elimination gets rid of the other answers, I think, quite well. C is the weirdest of the answers, and so is the one that deserves the most kind of careful consideration, but for the reasons we mentioned. Yeah, not quite right. All right. Nicely done. We may see another boldface question later, but for now, we're pivoting to inference questions. Cut. Inference questions are awesome. And I've got things to say about inference questions. So this is going to apply, honestly, to inference questions in critical reasoning, but also to inference questions in reading comprehension. They are not meaningfully different. The test rather is looking for the same thing from you on both types of inference question. And that same thing is, which statement is as true as anything said in the passage? The biggest difference between critical reasoning inference answers and reading comprehension inference answers is for critical reasoning, you'll often have to take into account the whole passage, like a few sentences. And in reading comprehension ones, you often only have to look at a sentence or two to figure it out. But sometimes you do have to take into account a whole lot more in reading comprehension. And similarly, sometimes in critical reasoning, your right answer is going to be right based on half of one of the sentences, all right? The only standard for determining right from wrong in inference questions is this something that must be true or not? All right, there's only going to be one answer in any inference question that must be true. All the other answers will be possibly false. And that's all that matters. Okay. Take a look at this. This is not how inference questions quite show up. This is just to get the ground rules of what they even mean by inference, because there are really only 3 styles of inference. All right, only 3 things that can really happen in inference. That is to say, there are only 3 ways that the GMAT can make an answer different from the passage, but as true as the passage, right? Like make an answer that seems like it's saying something new, but is really not saying something new. It might be a contender if it said the executive's claim, by the way, Sean, from that first one we looked at. Yeah. All right. Take a look at these 2 things here. So this is the way that inference questions are often phrased, though you won't have inference questions this short. This is just a kind of sample to get to know what inference actually means on the test. I'll also say the official guide for in its like verbal reasoning introduction has a really good description of the different question types and what they're really looking for from you. So I highly recommend that you read all that. It is surprisingly good, but we're also going to talk about it here. So out of 1 and 2, which one of these claims is best supported by the statement above, the claim above? So the claim above is anti-lock brakes are more effective at preventing collisions than are standard brakes. Do we believe 1 or 2? Should we choose 1 or 2 if this is the GMAT and we're trying to draw a conclusion based on that claim up there? And on some will say second. Absolutely. Absolutely. First one's the kind of one you'd probably want to draw in the real world, right? Like if you were going into a meeting with, the executives about this, you might want to go in with thing number 1 here, especially if you work for a car manufacturer, because like that feels like a pretty good extrapolation from what's up there, but it's not at all what the GMAT wants. The GMAT wants something that is as true as what's up there, and that is indeed number 2, which inference style number 1 is called a converse. There are 2 styles of inference that are super, super common. All right, they get used more than the third one. There are only really, again, 3 styles of inference, and we're going to see all 3 here real quick. This one is a converse. Converse is basically if the passage says A is greater than B, the converse says B is less than A. If the passage says that John is an eagle, then the converse is that John is not a dog or something like that, right? Just a converse basically takes what's said and says something equally true, but from the opposite point of view, right? And that's exactly what 2 is doing, right? That claim up there is from the point of view of anti-lock brakes. 2 is from the point of view of standard brakes, and it's saying the reverse, but it is, of course, saying something that is equally true, and that's what you want in an inference answer. Something that is not going to rock the boat, not going to say anything new. What you don't want in an inference answer is new terms, like car manufacturers. You don't want extremes, like always. So car manufacturers, always, new vehicles. There was nothing up there that said anything about vehicles specifically, though vehicles is probably the safest part of the new terms here, but always is hugely problematic. Just because anti-lock brakes are more effective at preventing collisions doesn't mean they might not have other problems of their own, right? And certainly car manufacturers are not in any way implicated by anything that's set up there. Watch out for new terms. Basically, if you see an answer choice in an inference or draw a conclusion question that you can weaken or that you can come up with a counterpoint to, that's not the right answer. That's absolutely the wrong answer. All right. Another. This time you can select more than one. And again, this is not the way it'll be on the test. This is just the exercise to get to know the different inference styles. There's a new style of inference on this slide. So you can select more than one, which one or ones seem right here. Remember, you're looking for something you know from certain if you accept the claims up above. I gotta vote for 1. Gotta vote for 1 and 3. 1, 4. Awesome. Loving this. Keep them coming, you guys. I'll take a couple more answers before the big reveal. Confused between 1 and 3. Maybe you don't need to be, Austin, because in this particular case, as I said, there can be more than one right answer. So if you think both are right, just, yeah, both. And Bhavana thinks so. 1 and 3 are valid, right there with an answer. So yeah, it is 1 and 3. 1 is a straight up converse, just like we saw in the last one, right? The first statement says the price of gasoline has steadily increased over the last 5 years. Look at that from the opposite point of view. The price of gasoline, or 5 years ago, the price of gasoline was less than it is now. Totally valid. 3 is also valid, but 3 is now a new kind of inference and the other major type called a synthesis. A synthesis is basically putting 2 ideas together into one. So if you know, like, A is greater than B and B is greater than C, the synthesis of that is, of course, A is greater than C. And that's what's going on here. You're using a piece of information from the first sentence, the price has increased steadily, and a piece of information from the second sentence during the same period, the quantity sold has also increased. If the price has increased and the quantity has increased, price times quantity gives you total expenditure. So total expenditure must have increased. All right. On the other hand, 2, driving longer distances, not necessarily. They could be driving shorter distances, but more frequently, for instance. Or they could be driving less fuel efficient cars or something like that. 4, owning an average car is a new term, which is going to be problematic here. And of course, that's because owning an average car is more general than simply the price of gasoline, right? Owning an average car is also repairs, insurance, car payments, and stuff like that. And so even though the price of gasoline has definitely gone up over those 5 years, maybe those other expenses have somehow miraculously come down. All right. Careful about answers that generalize a bit too much. And of course, careful about answers with new terms. All right. One last type of inference to show you, and this is the least common, and it's a bit like number 3 last time, because it's still kind of a synthesis. This one I'm going to take us through just so we have time to do a proper inference question. So, revenues of company X rose last year, but profits fell sharply. The claims above, if true, most strongly support which of the following conclusions? You're never going to have, unless you have a passage that's all in the future tense, you're never going to have a right answer for these questions that's in the future tense. That's a prediction right there. And we're looking for an answer we know for certain. We can't know anything about the future for certain unless the claims above are, again, in the future tense themselves, or if the claims above are saying, like, this is always the case. That is always the case. All right, so 1's out. 2, pursued less profitable sales over the course of last year. 2 gives you 2 classic wrong answer types in one on inference questions. Mind reading. So number 1 was a prediction. That's a classic wrong answer type in these inference questions. Number 2 is mind reading. Saying they pursued less profitable sales means they made a conscious choice to get less profitable sales. And we could just as easily believe they didn't pursue it, but they just got less profitable sales despite themselves, right? The other issue with 2 is it's an explanation. It seeks to offer a plausible explanation, and that will basically never be right in these inference questions because we want an answer that follows from what's set up there, and an explanation doesn't follow from anything, right? An explanation gives us a reason, like kind of a prequel to what's up there. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for something that is as true as what's up there, not something that explains what's up there. 3 is the right one. It's a bit of synthesis, but it's also the third kind of inference, the worst kind of inference. Application. Application, in a very general sense, application means going from general to specific or from specific to a qualified general. So, saying like, if I tell you that all birds are blue, for instance, then you can conclude that some animals are blue. That's a qualified generalization from the fact that all birds are blue. This is an application as well because we're taking facts up there and then just putting them in a kind of like presentation that was not necessarily called for up there. Like, we don't need profit as a percent of revenue as a necessary consequence of what's up there. But is that justified as an application? Yeah, totally. Profit as a percent of revenue definitely decreased last year at company X. So that's how applications often feel. You get some general truths up there and then they decide to put it into a specific container. As long as like in this case, it's mathematically justified, you're good to go. This is the rarest of the correct answer types in inference, both for reading comprehension and for critical reasoning, but it does come up every now and then. Still, your workhorses are synthesis and converse. All right, those are the ones that come up time and time and time again that you're going to see multiple times on any given verbal section. All right, so be on the lookout for those as we get ourselves into some questions, or a question at least. Take a look at this one. And again, I want to give you guys a little bit of time with it. We've had this kind of intro to inference. We know what inference is about. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to look at it. Pop answers into chat when you feel like you got some. All right, getting some answers in there. Get some more answers out there, and then we'll weigh in on this one. All right, cool. Got a vote for C and a vote for D. Nice. Another vote for C. All right. Wait, one or two more votes, and then it's time to discuss. All right. We are 50-50 between C and D. Not anymore, though. Now C won the tiebreaker. All right. It is, in this case, C. Now, why? What justifies it? We've got 1/3 of high school seniors saying that they have significant financial responsibilities, and later we've got 1/3 of these account holders has bounced a check. But these account holders, so it looks like the same number, except these account holders is not the same group as high school seniors. These account holders refers to the number of seniors who have opened a bank account. This sentence says it's the same percentage of seniors that's opened a bank account. And of course, that begs the question, same percentage as what? And boom, 80%. 80% of high school seniors have never taken a personal finance class, even though the same percentage of seniors has opened bank accounts. And 1/3 of these account holders has bounced a check. Now, this is a straight up synthesis, right? Like, we have to transfer this 80% to this same percentage here. We have to transfer that 80% then to these account holders. And then 1/3 of that 80%, right? So roughly what, 27% or so would have bounced a check. A little under 27%. But of course, the first thing just says 1/3 of high school seniors say that they have significant financial responsibilities. So it's fair to say the number of high school seniors, at least that say they have significant financial responsibilities, is greater than the number of seniors who have bounced a check. That's where that is coming from. And this is very much a straight up synthesis. Slight application, I guess. Now, what is up with D? Any high school seniors who contribute to food, shelter, or clothing for themselves or their families have significant financial responsibilities. So what they say about that is 1/3 of high school seniors say that they have significant financial responsibilities, and that those responsibilities include, but are not limited to, contributing to food, shelter, or clothing for themselves or their families. But does that mean that any high school seniors who are contributing to those things will say that they have significant financial responsibilities? Not necessarily. Basically, the reverse is not necessarily true here. We're starting with people who say that they have significant financial responsibilities, and we're just asking them, what do you guys mean? And they're like, yeah, well, we have to contribute to food, shelter, or clothing for ourselves or our families, and it's not even limited to that. But that's just because we just asked that 1/3 of high school seniors what they meant by significant financial responsibilities. The other 2/3 of high school seniors haven't been asked anything. And for all we know, they could also be contributing to food, shelter, or clothing and just not called it a significant financial responsibility. And that's subtle, but that ends up ruining D on this one. All right. And that is exactly right. The easier way to look at it, or, the way that you can raise your own suspicions against D is any, right? So watered down answers in inference questions, both on reading comprehension and on critical reasoning, watered down answers that say what may be the case or could be the case, answers with things like and stuff like that, those go to the front of the line, right? Those are going to be safer answers. Whereas extreme answers, any high school seniors who contribute, red flags, right? Any, all, every, things like that are going to be pretty hard to justify. The right answer in inference questions can always be less extreme than the claims in the passage. But the right answer can never be more extreme than the claims in the passage. And so, yeah, red flag when you see a word like any in these questions. It's trouble. All right. I was going to say something so important there. Just kidding. I wasn't going to say anything that important. Do look for the nice watered down language, though. It's kind of like, I always go to the Geico commercials. One call we have here, one call could save you 15% or more on car insurance is the tagline for these commercials. And they can make that tagline and not worry about lawsuits because they said one call could save you 15% or more, which means they've said nothing. That claim must be true, basically. And so when you see words like could or may or might or things like that in these answers, they're going to be pretty hard to eliminate because a claim that's saying what could be the case is not committing to that much, and so is more likely to be true. All right. We're going to do one more quick one, you guys, and then we're going to call it a day, an evening, a night, whatever it may be. Take a crack at this. Again, I'll back off for a minute or two until some answers come in, and we'll discuss. Nice. We've got our first answer in. It's D. Anybody agree? Go for it. Or disagree? Go for that too. Anjay agrees. Austin agrees. It's looking pretty good for D right now. All right. I think D's have it. Absolutely. We know that network television commercials accounted for 80% of all network advertising revenue, network and non-network advertising revenue in 1984, but in 2004 the figure was 60%, and yet their actual money from that revenue had increased. So even though the percentage share had decreased, the actual money had definitely increased. And we just need to find a conclusion that can be drawn from that fact. A is trying to give us an explanation for why this might have happened. But again, explanations are bad news. B is the exact same thing, trying to give us an explanation for why non-network has kind of risen in profile, risen in percentage share over this time. But this is not something that has to be true to explain it, right? And that's why explanations tend to be bad, because whatever cause they're purporting to give us, there could be an alternate cause. It's the same issue as in cause and effect arguments that frequently show up in critical reasoning. C is pretty tempting, I know, to some people. There we go. Some votes for C right there. But because it's about the amount of advertising revenue earned from non-network television commercials, and it's comparing it to the amount of revenue earned by network television commercials in 1984, it's a bit problematic. So in 2004, non-network commercial revenue is 40% of the total revenue, right? And in 1984, network commercial revenue was 60% of the total. Now, or sorry, 80% of the total. Now, we know that even in reducing their share to 60%, their profits went up, right? So it's clear that the absolute amount of money involved in all of this stuff is going up over time, right? Going up by more than, I guess, a third or thereabouts, right? To get money from 60% share that exceeds the money you were getting from 80% share. But does that mean that the 40% the non-network revenue is getting exceeds the 80% they were getting before? Not necessarily, because that would require basically overall revenues to have like doubled in that time roughly. And all we can really say from the number comparison here is that it went up by like at least about a third, not necessarily that it doubled. So C might be true, but it's not necessarily true. All right. We cannot say for sure that that 40% is more than the 80% there. And careful, they are really leaning into this non-network versus network thing. It would be totally fair to say the amount of advertising revenue earned from non-network in 2004 is greater than the amount earned from non-network in 1984. But comparing it to network is tricky because network had such a greater percentage in 1984. Diesel one. We know that like non-network got a higher kind of revenue share over this time, but we also know that network was gaining more money over this time, so the advertising revenue must have really grown for non-network because it got both a greater share and a greater share of what is a bigger pie, essentially more money. And so yeah, it definitely grew at a faster rate, right? It's got two things going in its direction: percentage increase and money increase, whereas network only has one thing going in its direction: money increase, but the percentage decreased. And you can back this up with actual numbers if you want to test numbers here, because this is a highly mathematical one, as a lot of these inference questions will be. And E is a prediction, so that's always bad news, right? Predictions, mind reading, explanations, never going to be right. There it is, y'all. D is the one. And with that, we conclude today. We have drawn a conclusion for today. If there are any questions real quick about any of these things we saw, ask by all means. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming out to this GMAT Club / Manhattan Prep presentation of Boldface and inference questions. Some of the best questions out there. One last thing I want to say, there are not like huge numbers of these on the test. They're definitely more rarely encountered than the assumption family questions. I would expect on any given test for you to have maybe 2 or 3 of each type. But again, remember that the skills tested in them will also come up pretty heavily in reading comprehension. So practicing one helps you with the other side for sure. And inference questions are a huge deal in reading comprehension, right? Oh, yeah, I did. Thanks, VG. That was what I was referring to earlier. I have made mistakes on YouTube before, but it was fun. Good. Bhavna, you got the secret formula. You're going to be fine. All right, you guys. Listen, if you have further questions, please, there's my email address. Feel free to send me an email. But for now, we will end it here. Thank you all for coming out. I hope you go on to have a great day, night, morning, whatever it may be for you.